Hey, good afternoon. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from the world headquarters of the Philanthropy Mastermind series, which means my house as usual. And I'm so glad you can hang out with us today because we've got a friend, both of the series, but more importantly to philanthropy, and the great Larry Johnson here, who will be talking all about this major subject today, about this kind of way of rethinking, if you will, the fundraising culture and the organizational culture that facilitates it. So with that, I want to just give a couple of quick notes before we begin, so you can participate in this discussion. Since we can't see or hear you, we do want to hear your thoughts, which we can do through two ways. And the first of which is the chat. So you can see that right below on your screen. And please, if you would, go ahead and just let us know that you're here right now. Just go ahead and fire that thing up. It'll be very helpful to Mr. Johnson, so he'll know that you're with us. Just say maybe where you're in here from, state, city, country, organization, whatever you wish to include. It'd be wonderful to see that. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Dorit, Cynthia. I see a lot of names here. This is wonderful. So it's going to be a nice group. This will be a perfect place to chat for you to have a conversation as we go through the conversation today. But I'm also going to encourage you later on to use the Q&A. Somebody's already posted something there. That's terrific. The Q&A will be for, of course, the questions. We probably won't be using it to answer the questions today, but we will be using it to store up all those nuggets and then ensure that Larry has a chance to address those questions with you. So again, chat for conversation, Q&A for questions, and I know that was already obvious, but it's important to note as we begin. I do want to also do a major shout out to our sponsors for this entire series, going back to 2016, and that's our friends at DonorSearch. That's the only thing you'll hear in the way of advertising for DonorSearch today, and that's unfortunate because they have a lot to share with you. So I would encourage you to just take a look over at donorsearch.net. Also the repository for all these conversations in the Philanthropy Mastermind series. And you can find it under the resources tab there. DonorSearch is a terrific place to learn more about the people who love what you do and want to support it. Maybe some new friends too. So at the end of the session today, I hope you'll look for other conversations like this one. This one will be stored there very shortly. And also maybe check out what they do, because if you care about your donors, and I'm sure you do, you'll want to know more about what DonorSearch can do to help you understand them. So with that, I'm going to jump into the conversation with Larry Johnson, and I'll just give a little bit of an introduction, if I may, Larry, and then ask you to talk a little bit more. Larry Johnson, CFRE, has over 20 years of direct involvement with charitable fund development and nonprofit management. If it sounds like I'm reading, I am, because I'm reading from a book you want on your shelf. I only pulled mine down so I could show it to you, which of course is the 8 Principles of Sustainable Fundraising. And I know he'll be drawing a little bit from that today, as well as telling you about the new edition of this book. He's a graduate of both Vanderbilt and Yale. His career began in the Fortune 100 program management area before moving into charitable fundraising with Ketchum, a firm I'm sure you know, later serving as chief advancement officer for 4 colleges and universities prior to founding ME Grace in 2007. But of course, he has his own practice, and he'll tell you all about that in the course of our conversation today. But it's really a pleasure to welcome back our friend, Larry Johnson. Thank you so much for hanging out, Larry.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Jay. I've been looking forward to this, actually, very much.
Well, it's always great to see you.
And just for the people out there, I'm in the Rocky Mountains. All right, I'm a little bit further west. I saw a few people from Oregon and Colorado, so they're out this way. But yeah, and so yes.
And from Richmond too. We just saw some popping in. So thank you for the shout out from my fellow Virginian. And if you don't know Larry's work, but you are in his neck of the woods, you may see him, among other things, on a motorcycle. So it's among the many ways that he stays grounded, literally, as well as figuratively in this field. Larry, I know our subject today, which you chose, is again all about this topic about fundraising culture. Do you mind if I just start with the simplest question, which is, how do you define fundraising culture?
Well, a simple definition would be the prevailing paradigm, period. All right. Now, we're going to be talking about how do we get a culture that is highly productive and sustainable. You can have a dysfunctional culture. You can have a pathological culture. Okay. But you're going to have one, all right, whatever it is. And so it's the prevailing paradigm, whatever's there. People who say they don't, they just haven't looked hard enough, all right, or they're in it so deep they don't even recognize it, one or the other. But if you're going to have a productive and sustainable and scaling culture, you need something that I call alignment. And alignment is really two things. It's aligning everyone in the organization to have the same understanding,
Mhm.
but it's also having the right paradigm of philanthropy in the beginning. And it's those two things together that create an organization that really just can't be stopped when it comes to raising money sustainably over time. And I want to make that very clear, and that everyone understand that's my perspective, that's my lens. I'm not
Mhm.
looking at one shots. I'm not looking at particular types of methods or things like that, because if you have the right alignment of everyone in the organization, and then you have the right alignment with what I call the relational philanthropic paradigm, then you'll be in a position, and that's the proverbial you, not the individual you'll be in a position to construct your fundraising activities and execute them in such a way that you'll fulfill that. See, there's the key. Most people go right to methods. They go right to process. Well, what do I need to do X or do Y or whatever? Well, that's okay, but it's not the real question that should be asked first. Because if you're asking process first, the chances of getting it right drop down to around, 0.01%. It just doesn't happen naturally. There has to be an understanding. And that's why I say to people that you must get the right mindset before you begin to pull the right tools out of the box, because not every tool works in every place. And now, for those of you who are with the Indiana school, and I like you guys over there, you use a term that I really don't like, and that term is best practices. There is no such thing as a single set of best practices, because what is best for your organization won't necessarily be best for another. Now, that's not the same thing as not being professional or understanding what strategy is all about. And I think that's probably where they're coming from. But I mean, and I don't want to get into too much storytelling, but I did go there a few years ago, and I submitted my talk, and I said, best practice is the ultimate oxymoron. And I got a call back from the committee chair, and she said, two people on our committee were personally insulted. And I said, oh, get over it. I said, you guys still go to work in ox carts over there? When's the last time you used a rotary telephone? Things change. And even now, different organizations, whether it's a faith-based organization or social service or it's education, whatever it might be, they're going to have a different fundraising paradigm that makes them collect and put their program together differently. You see, and if they're just kind of pulling things off and hope it worked over here, so it must work over here. Well, that won't necessarily follow. So that was a longer answer than you were anticipating, but
Well, no, but there's so much to break down in there. So, from a tactical perspective, you could sit here and we could talk about direct mail, let's say, and let's not do that. But if we were doing that, we could talk about what are some of the quote best practices for getting people within your organization to identify a list. Maybe what are the things that might help with a letter to be successful? And I know it's going to be particular to the organization, but those kinds of things, those tactical elements, are process, I guess, right? So
that process.
if it's the processes that we're talking about, maybe there are some things that could be beneficial across many different
Well,
types of organizations. But you're being much more specific. So when you say something like, "How do you find the best practices essentially that are best for you?" How do you talk to people about that? What are the ways to find what's best for the organization itself and the individual at the organization?
well, it's sort of what I'm doing for a living now. I mean, for a long time, I was in direct fundraising. I worked, as a part of one of the national consulting firms, and this is the old catch-up, the old days. They're really old days. And then I was in higher ed, which tends to have the more sophisticated fundraising programs, but not necessarily. And this then I came into my own. So then, what I teach people, and we do this through live workshops that are Covey-esque type, because we believe that everybody ought to be able to have access to this. It's not just about the fundraisers. Remember what I said about alignment? From the desk clerk to the board chair, Everybody ought to be able to get in that room and go like this. So to
Mhm.
answer your question, and this is where my book comes in, I didn't start out with the number 8. It just ended up that way. Okay. The 8 principles, these are truisms that are based on human behavior. Uh, they're behavioral psychology. They never vary. And I can tell you they don't even vary with regard to culture, because we're going to be going into South Asia, in India, and in November, and it's going to be the same thing there, is that these things are active all the time. And you need to know what those are. And so that it's like gravity. You're either working with it or you're working against it. And if you're working, because you're not going to change it, it's not going to change. So if you understand what those principles are, you really internalize them and you know what they really mean, the next step is to begin to go, okay, so we know what the principles are. What about what's our organization look like? What are the assumptions? How do people interact? What's our donor base, or our constituent base? All, and the collectively, I call that the paradigm, the worldview, the way you look at things. And
Mhm.
that's where it becomes organizationally specific at that point, because your worldview is going to change. So then you take your worldview and you look at the principles and you kind of let those come through your paradigm, and you go, oh, okay, now I know which things are going to work and which things aren't going to work. Then it becomes fairly easy. But more often than not, people don't start there. They want to go right to process, or they some new whiz bang technology or some new way of
And,
doing,
and and why is that? Why is it that people default to that?
because it's more concrete. It is more immediate. um I mean, haven't we all been in board meetings when the board chair says, what are you doing philosophizing? Get the hell out there and raise money. I mean, that's the sort of impetus that people have. Well, that okay. But if you don't take the time to get that together and understand, the chances of getting to the right place are pretty small. And not everybody knows what the 8 principles are. Get it. But I can tell
Yes,
you,
and in fact, I just as somebody did ask about the book. They came in probably a minute late, and so this is the book that documents, if you will, and expounds on the 8 principles. But please go ahead.
so, but I can guarantee you that you show me a performing organization that is sustainable and scalable, and I can go down the principles, every single one of them, and say, yep, 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 they're following them all, even if they don't know they're following them. And that's good for them. But that's the key, is to step back. Well, let's use a military analogy. Um, we just went through the anniversary of D-Day. That was a tremendous undertaking. It took 2 years of planning. There was so much strategy involved, and the politics of it. I mean, there was a whole political level to it, as well as the actual strategy. That all was settled first before the
Mhm.
technical pieces were put in place that would actually execute the invasion. Because if they just willy-nilly thrown some forces over there, the chances of success would have been very, very small. Even then, it was an open question whether they were going to be successful or not. So it's the same thing. Strategy planning predates execution. It has to. And you have to understand, what are those principles that are defining what you can operate within, that you're never going to get around. And if you know what those are, then, well, actually, it makes your job a lot easier. Then you're not guessing anymore. And
Right.
then you take those and okay, here's our organization. We're a Y, or we're a museum, or we're an education, or whatever it might be. Um, we know certain things about our organization, type of constituency, the goals, these kinds of things. And we really take some good, healthy looks at those things, the good, bad, and the ugly. Okay. And then from that, you go, now I get this. Now I understand what I can do and what I can't do. It was like, about 5 years ago, we were doing a beta session on one of our live workshops. It was the very first one. And we were in front of a board of a social service agency, about 13, 14 people. I was watching this. It's only 3 hours long, and they were doing activities or whatever. And there was a presentation being made, and out of the blue, the board chair just leaps up out of his seat. Well, I've been in the business long enough to think, are we going to get thrown out of here or what? What's going on? And so he says instead, now I get this. Now I understand this. The light went on for him. So as a result, we've named that workshop the aha moment. He had his aha moment.
Right.
And
I'm always looking for those. But it's, so that's a great concrete example. Can you take us maybe through an example of and you don't have to name the organization, of course, but how they found their vision, so to speak, their not their vision, excuse me, how, that paradigm that you're describing, how they found that, because it doesn't always happen in that 3 hour workshop. Obviously, a lot of things happen before. You made things happen there.
well,
So for
that's
most
just the
organizations, how
beginning.
does it happen?
Just understanding the fact of what's really going on, because that workshop really talks about relational philanthropy, which is the other piece of it. Let me talk about that for a minute, okay? Then we'll come back to your
Yeah,
question.
yeah, yeah.
You can get everyone aligned, principles, paradigm, process. You can do
Mhm.
that. But if you don't have a firm understanding, which is part of the principles, I guess, of relational philanthropy, you're still going to struggle. Relational philanthropy is a very different concept from what you see in about 95% of the time, if you're looking at it. And that is, most organizations who are nonprofits,
Mhm.
they do worthy work. Great, no problem. They look at, here's my mission. I need to raise resources for that mission. Some of it may come from fee from service, some of it may come from something else, but some of it's going to come from philanthropy, more often than not. Some of it. All right. They view it as, I'm going out to get resource to apply to my mission, and I'm going forward with it. That is not the relational paradigm. The relational paradigm says, my donors are my investors. I'm focusing not on my mission, but on them, their needs, their desires, their dreams. And the match occurs when those also coincide with what I'm trying to achieve. You see, that's the key. But the focus still has to be on the investors. And that's the reason I call them investors. And what investors want, what? They want a return, don't they? Now, in the philanthropic world, it's just not a material return. It's an emotional return. And when I say to people, you're offering your investors something far more valuable than they're giving you, I get a lot of blank looks, because it's not about the money. It's never about the money.
Oh, right.
All right. There's at least, my friends in the wealth management business tell me there's at least $1 to $2 billion of unengaged money that's sitting out there. I don't mean money that's in donor advised funds. I mean truly unengaged, sitting on the table, waiting for someone to come and engage it kind of money, because they approach they approach it with the, we need this, or we need that, or we're trying to accomplish this. It's not about what you're trying to accomplish. It's about what the donors want to see happen. And that requires a totally different mindset that has to pervade everything, from the person that answers the phone to the person who's the head of the board. And once people really understand that, and they realize that they are the servants of their investors, then that's when a lot of magic begins to happen. That's when you don't have to worry about too little. You have to begin to worry how to manage too much. And I'm quite
There's
serious about that.
a conversation that that we've had forever in philanthropy and fundraising, but it's particularly fiery in the last few years, and that's to do with community-centered fundraising and philanthropy. And it's often put as if it's a competition between community-centered and donor-centered. But I'm not delving into that. I'm just thinking about what you said about the evolution of things, how things are always changing. That's how you began much of this conversation today. Um, as things change, our audience of donors changes, as well as staff changes and board changes. But sometimes it seems that a criticism from many quarters is that the change seems to be slower within an institution, especially at the board level, than it does within the communities that we work with and partner with and potentially and hopefully serve. So as you're thinking through this and advising organizations to be centered on the right things, to follow those 8 principles, but to do it in a way that's looking at where we are and where we're going, not where we were, how do you help them to ensure that they're really thinking about the future, not just the past?
Who's the we? Who's thinking?
The organization, because often the board will be reflective of the donors of the past, and God love them, but they aren't necessarily reflective of the donors of the future, generational change, things of that nature.
Well, there are two things to think about here. First of all,
Mhm.
the first one is mainly internal to the organization.
Mhm.
It's something that has to be decided at that level. You
Right.
know, there's good news and bad news about change being slow. And that's change is slow. That's good news and bad news, because what you don't get if it changes too fast, or this kind of trendy sort of response to whatever is out there in the moment. That's, the idea of, that's the classic idea of conservatism, is that you make changes on a slow basis. But then there's the other thing, I think, as it's implied, is how does that affect your outreach to others? And I go back to principle one of the 8 principles, and that is donors are the drivers. And whether people are happy with it or not, they are driving the train. They're in control. And an attempt to wrest that control from them will result in not so good fundraising results. And they will, and so they have to work within that. And it's like any sort of, see, philanthropy is market driven, like anything else is. There's a market for it. There's a profile of people who actually make philanthropic gifts. I mean, and DonorSearch is getting into AI with Nathan and those folks, and he and I have had conversations about this. For instance, the number one indicator for philanthropic proclivity is transcendence, church membership, any kind of religious adherence. If someone has that, then they're much more likely to be philanthropic, mainly because philanthropy is at its very base a spiritual exercise of someone's base values, either big S or little s. It's not a transaction. And when people understand that, a whole new opportunity opens up, because then you can really focus on those people that are going to have an affinity for you. And you don't have to use this shotgun approach, which is so prevalent, even with the new targeted tools.
This is interesting, because we are also seeing that decline in the middle of the donor population, right? And that seems to have continued. So these results from Giving USA are great numbers, but only in terms of the total dollars, not in terms of the donor population.
And I would, and I can't prove it, but I would suggest that it's a lack of engagement. There's something that's missing there, because I don't think human nature's changed. No.
Right.
I think it's the way people are being approached or not being approached.
So maybe that goes back to, of course, the origin of this conversation, which is about, have they done that vetting process? Have they figured out, are they aligned? What is it they're trying to align themselves around? And then are they aligned within? So maybe we can go back to that. You talked about what fundraising culture was and wasn't. What about making sure that you have that alignment? You use that D-Day example, which struck me, because even though it's far away and we should have distance from it, sometimes we forget some of the salient lessons. So one of them is the one you alluded to, which is that you had to get everybody on board, but they really weren't all on board for a while, and even go until the last minute.
To the last minute. I mean, Churchill managed to put the whole thing off 18 months because he felt that the way in was through the southern end, not the northern end. Stalin was jumping up and down because he wanted a second front opening, because the Wehrmacht was on the suburbs of Moscow. I mean, it wasn't a group of happy campers. And then once you got the politics settled, then how do you manage these armies from various countries? Great Britain, Australia, Canada, the US, who's going to be in charge? How's that going to work? I mean, that sounds like a nonprofit board meeting, doesn't it? And
yeah, you have to get your vision aligned and then your mission aligned. Sometimes people invert those, and then the strategy, but that's built around people's willingness to kind of share power. That's hard. I don't know how you do nonprofits. There's no general except the Salvation Army.
From an historical point of view, that's the reason that Eisenhower's choice was so prescient, because he was willing to share power. He was politically savvy enough to know that he had to have a British adjutant. He couldn't appoint an American adjutant. That would really piss the Brits off, and likely so, even though by that time in the war, the Brits were definitely the junior partners. You see, that was the Tehran conference, where Churchill really felt like the British Empire was slipping from him. He knew the world was changing. And so he knew that he was no longer in the number one seat anymore, and that he had to sort of play second fiddle to Franklin Roosevelt. And he was trying to manage that relationship. So there all these different levels were going on. This wasn't some fait accompli. as you said. And so then, but Eisenhower was politically savvy enough and also comfortable in his own skin that he could say, okay, we're going to appoint a British adjutant, who at that time was Montgomery, who was known to be Class A prima donna. He was not easy to get along with, and so how do you deal with that? Well, does this sound like a nonprofit? Yes, it does. It does.
Okay,
It's
but
no
let's,
different.
but for those who are still, trying to make that connection to their nonprofit, let's bring that right up to a contemporary example. So, as you've worked with a number of these folks, can you kind of paint us a picture of what that might look like? Who are in that example? Our FDR is, and our our Eisenhower is, and our Montgomery
Okay.
is on an organizational level.
Well, let me, if you have a few moments, I'm going to describe a situation in which I was a staff member. I can't get too specific because then I'll start naming names, and that's not
Right,
what I
right,
do.
right.
All right.
Of course.
This particular organization was working hard to move into truly professional strategic philanthropy.
Hmm.
All right. They had a reasonably long history, but a pretty ho-hum fundraising program, non-professional. All right. The leader of the organization was well liked, had a decent tenure, but was uncomfortable with fundraising. Does that sound familiar? Okay. So the key is there was a small core of people on the board that wanted to change things in a serious way. And they were able to convince the leader that this is what he needed to do. He was approaching retirement. This is your chance to make a difference. All right. So yours truly was brought in as the first professional, truly professional, to lead their program.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was faced with an organization that was just not professional, period, from top to bottom. The work ethic wasn't there. When I say work ethic, it wasn't that people were lazy. It's just that there wasn't the right professional focus. People didn't understand what their jobs really were. Okay. So it took time from top to bottom, beginning with the board, to put this together. And so we started at the board level. And what I would do would be, I'd go to, well, if I'm going to do something, the next thing I'm going to do, if I'm going to try to accomplish something at a board meeting, I'm going to visit every board member individually first. Okay. I'm not going into a board meeting without the votes lined up. Okay. I know what I'm doing here. I don't just dump things at a board meeting. That's all. Board meeting is perfunctory. Okay. We've made our decision before we get there. And I think that's something that nonprofits need to remember, is to do enough background work and strategy to get people on board, starting with the most influential people on that committee, who would begin to influence others. Because it wasn't my job, single-handedly to, slay Goliath here. It was one at a time is what we'd be doing. So then gradually, we began to move out into other areas of the organization to promote this message. It had to be done repetitively. But the key was the leader. You still had to convince him. Well, fortunately, and this is where some degree of luck played into it, this man was great at making friends. He was terrible at closing. So I arrived, and this was an organization that had never raised more than $3 million in cash in its entire 90-year history, any given year. I said, all right, if we book 20 million in the first year, I want a 20% raise. And he looked at me and said, okay. So that's exactly what we did. Was I Moses? No. They looked at me like Moses, but I wasn't. What I did was go around, identify the relationships that were mature, and close those first. And that was enough to get to the 21 million that we booked in the first year. This was toward a capital campaign. That set the motion for everything else. No one would say no then, because we had that initial success. And that applies whether it's big or little, is having an initial success. Now, the other piece of it is I was there long enough to see things really fundamentally change, beginning to change people's attitudes, replace staff where necessary, because not everyone was going to go with a new program. That's just the way it is. And so you just move on through. Now, that was one example. Let's take it down and what happens if you don't follow through. On another organization, I was a consultant and I came in and I made very similar changes, a smaller group. All right. They were doing great. I was only there 6 months, Jay. Guess what happened after I left?
I'm afraid.
All right.
Yes.
So this was the impetus when that happened, and I'd seen it happen more than once. This was the impetus for saying, okay, how can we short circuit this? How can we make it be steady? And that's why, I personally spent the last 5 years developing this continuous learning program, something that is implantable in an organization, that's repeatable, that's for everybody, that doesn't require a high level of fundraising expertise to do. And I learned that, this wasn't my idea originally. If anyone knows who Stephen Covey is, that's exactly what he did in the leadership agenda. He created the same sort of program where it's not in a classroom setting, it's active. Everyone's doing it together. They're not listening to someone talk to 10-point slides. Oof. Well, it just makes me shiver. And so, but it's there all the time. It's theirs, and they adopt it as theirs, and they build it with their paradigm, and then it stays. Because
let me ask you about that though, because first of all, not everybody's going to have the benefit of working either with you or with a paradigm like that, or any kind of approach or system. But assuming that they either are or they're receptive to at least the principles that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. What else makes fertile ground? So in the case of these two examples you just gave, for example, you had I guess the board chair or the CEO of the one organization.
Willing leadership is the number one thing.
Okay. So willing leadership, even if the person has more of a skill in making friends than asking for money, they're willing to at least have the conversation and to make it possible for a person to come in and make it happen.
Here's the criteria.
Okay.
There has to be a real desire to grow.
Okay.
A lot of people say they want to grow, but they're not.
But that's not the same thing.
No, yeah. They just want to be in a comfort zone, and that's where a lot of organizations are. Number one. Number two, they must be willing to try something new or different from what they're currently doing. Okay. Three, they have to accept some level of risk in the short and midterm. It isn't delivered fait accompli. All right. So those are the three major things: a genuine desire to grow, a willingness to do something different, all right, and the willingness to accept some level of risk. All right. And of course, we see a lot of nonprofits that would like to grow, but they don't want to risk anything. They don't want to change anything. And you're not going to get any difference if that's the case. You're just going to kind of nibble around the edges. And that's what you're going to do.
It's interesting because when you raise that, that is one of the arguments that's made by people who say we need to focus on the needs and interests of individual wealthy donors less and more on the needs and interests of the community. But before we go there, because that could take us off course, and I understand your point. I'm just raising it because I know somebody will, and they'll say, why didn't we talk about it? But we have a question from an attendee who had said, when people have different visions and ideas, how do you get everyone on board, especially when certain people dominate the conversation? So in the case of that where you came onto the staff, not the consultative example, but the first one, it sounds like you said, it was fertile ground. They were willing, they were saying they wanted to make a change, and they were actually willing to do it. But in other places, we've both seen this a lot, where there's one person who just dominates everything. And so how do you work with that? What are the drivers for helping the whole organization to work with or around that force?
Well, sometimes there has to be a change of personnel. And when I say personnel, I don't mean just staff. All right. And I've been in situations where I've been asked to, for lack of a better term, blow up a board or fire people, or however you want to put it. But it's done in a way that it doesn't result in chaos or a cataclysm. What you do is you begin to redefine the social contract. And you have to, of course, have someone who's going to be championing this. If no one's willing to stand up and say, I think we need to go a different way, well, then you're never going to get anywhere. You just maybe need a new job. But if someone, and they don't have to be necessarily the one that's controlling, it could be somebody else. is willing to say, okay, let's do something differently. And then where that works best is when you do bring in someone from the outside, because that person's going to redefine, and the consultant comes in or the coach comes in and they redefine what real good philanthropy looks like. And you got people nodding and other people going like this. And if they realize that the people that are going like this are fewer than the people that are going like this, most of them will self-select off because they realize that things are changing. And it gives them an opportunity, the person who doesn't think this is for them, to leave in a way that preserves their dignity. Because just because someone isn't useful or productive in their particular situation, that doesn't mean they're not useful or productive with the organization. It means that
Oh,
they just
right.
need to be someplace else. You see, so many organizations see board membership as a reward. It's not a reward, it's a responsibility. And not everybody fits that profile. But somebody who's a difficult board member could be a really terrific volunteer advocate in a different way. And oftentimes when you give people that opportunity, and you don't you're not confrontational with them, it's just like, oh, they get the message. It's a relief to them. It's really a relief to them. You're not doing anyone any favor to avoid them. So that's a way to do it. I've done that several times. It's pretty effective.
And maybe we can flip to the other example from it about the that consultative agreement where you came in and presumably you did kind of go through that process of writing the ship and probably from top to bottom to get that alignment. And
Yeah.
we had a question from Brooke, and I hope, Brooke, this is an appropriate use of your question, but about tips on follow through. Now, and this may have to do with the consultants in our audience, but it may also just be with anybody on the staff. Once you get that alignment, it seems to be like, the spine is actually positioning itself properly. That doesn't necessarily mean that it continues that way. Are there tips that you have on follow through, whether it's as a consultant or as a staff member or a board member?
Well, I mean, if people want to have me continue to be a part of their organization, either on a sporadic or periodic basis, that's an option. But that gets expensive after a while.
Right.
And and that goes back to the reason why I did the continuous learning, is that it's a lot less expensive than having me personally show up. It's Larry in a box is what my guy calls it. So anyway, but because in this case, in the particular case we're talking about, they had a leadership change. The CEO left and went elsewhere, and then that's when one board member who was still on there, and I even see this lady too today, decided it was time to re-exert herself, and so that's what happened. And the irony of it, this is a chapter of a national federated organization. And within 18 months after I left, their fundraising was so bad that the national was threatening to pull their charter. That's how bad it was, because they were doing things so dysfunctionally. I mean, it can be a real nightmare.
I know it's hard to even talk about these things as a giant umbrella when the situation at every individual organization is so different from every other organization. And for that matter, for those in our audience, if you have a specific question about forming that alignment within your organization or a particular issue that you're having and you want to have that addressed, I don't have to read your name, but it is something we can talk about. So feel free to use either the chat or preferably the Q&A for that. But getting into that, we've talked about fundraising alignment. You've talked a lot about the board. I did want to ask you, this might be a tough question, but you probably have a ready answer, which is a lot of people come into the field not necessarily having chosen this field. We discover ourselves there, and so did I. And that means that we don't necessarily know what we can do to create a proper influence from the bottom. So even if we see the proper principles, the right paradigm, we understand the mission and vision, we know that the strategy is going to work, our influence may be instrumental in this, but we may not know how to exercise that influence. So when you talk about, again, creating this alignment, then following through on it, are there ways that people kind of in the early stages of their career or within an organization, or maybe in the middle, can exercise their influence to ensure that things are on track?
Well, I'm going to use a Covey metaphor. All right. And that is, for those of you who've read The Seven Habits, you know Covey's concept of the sphere of influence versus the sphere of concern. All
Mhm.
right. And
Yes.
depending on where you are in the organization, your sphere of influence will be larger or smaller. The difficulty many times is that people are focused on their sphere of concern, things that they really cannot materially affect, rather than things that they can materially affect. So that when you're in an organization that has some of these issues, you have a certain sphere of influence, things that you can materially make a difference on. If you will
Mhm.
focus only on those things, oh, that's so hard because you see this other stuff that really needs to be fixed. And and that's what I say about nonprofit people sometimes. God save me from nice people, because they're so focused on doing the right thing out here, they realize they have no ability to affect that. Okay.
Mhm.
It's like, it's like watching the news. It's like, well, I can't affect what's going on there. So I'm not going to spend my energy, getting riled up or spinning my wheels or anything else, because I can't make a material impact on that. What I can make a material impact is right here. And that is where I'm going to focus my attention. And if you will do that, you will find, as Covey will say, that your sphere of influence will actually grow. And that's how, from an organizational point of view, you'll probably get promoted. You'll move up, and then your sphere of influence grows, because that's where you're focused. Um,
We do have a comment here, which I think may relate to this. Let me see. The similar issue with the organization I work for. The staff is along, and the board, however, it is the top two leaders that are holding everyone else back. They create their own fundraising strategies, excluding the advancement team. How have you handled situations with the organizations you've consulted with?
well, if I'm an employee, a staff member, there's not a lot I can do unless I'm looking for a new job. Okay. I mean, there's the reality of it. If I'm a consultant, um, a coach, depending on the situation, you take the person aside and you have a come to Jesus meeting with them. You let them know what's really going on. And part of that is, if you're doing a study inside, you're interviewing people anonymously. If you're interviewing people anonymously, people will tell you anything if they know that they're not going to be quoted. And so that's what I've used in the past. It's pretty shocking to some leaders, because most of these people are not bad people. It's just that they have a blind spot, or several, or
Right.
whatever, or they've got some fixed idea of how things ought to be. And this is an area that's received a lot of attention in the corporate world in recent years. And there's a whole field of it called process consulting. One of my friends is a high-level process consultant, and that's what he does for a living. Is he goes in and he tells people, he works with high-level CEOs, and says, this is where your issues are. And I'll tell you a little story. I won't name the company, but he was working for a Fortune 50 company, meaning it was one in the top 50 in the country, and in terms of size. And he was working with the CEO, and the CEO was one of these, oh, I really want people to be participative. Do it this way, do it this way, do it this way. You've seen those people. So he queued him up. He said, bring all your C-level staff and their support staff, and we're going to have this big planning session. And so he went in and he said, okay, we're going to have an open setting, and I'm willing to hear anything and whatever, however you want to do it. And they had a wonderful session. Well, at the end of it, they walked out of the meeting, and the CEO says to my friend, the consultant, oh, these are the people I want sent to HR. And my consultant said, no, that is not what this is about. You don't get it. So
Oh,
even after
wow.
all that, and he did back off, he realized, oh, I sound like an idiot, because he was like, okay, check, John, Mary, Sarah, but you're out of here, So,
Wow.
well, and we see the same thing in nonprofits. It's just that they're a little nicer about it. That's all. In fact, in some ways, it's more devious because they're trying to be nice.
Okay, so I don't usually do this, but I have to share a story because it is a worst case scenario. So after I was in giving, the first job I was in that was kind of program and working its way into fundraising, and I won't say where, I was at the organization just a mere, I think, 4 weeks or something, and the CEO was actually on the other part of the country, and then they would come in and out of the office on occasion. So we were kind of an isolated island in this organization, and the CEO was going to come in, so we were all brought into the deputy's office, and all sat in a circle. And that person made this great talk about all the things we were doing together and why it was so important. And then everybody had a chance to weigh in and all that. And after that meeting, I think a third of the staff was let go. Now, somehow I survived the meeting, and I don't know if it was just because of luck, because I was only there for 4 weeks, because I wasn't talking. Maybe I said something. I don't know. I'll never know. It doesn't matter. But yes, this kind of dysfunction, and including on the communication side, is a big issue. And we haven't talked about that much. And I'm trying to remember if that's a piece of the 8 principles. But communications are a part of this, right?
Principle 2, begin at the beginning.
Thank you.
All right. And the beginning is to craft your message, and I use that big M, not little m, okay, in a manner using the concepts and vocabulary and paradigm of your potential supporters.
Right.
And that is not easy to do.
And that's at every level, right? To again, go back to your alignment. It's the conversation with staff. It's the conversation with board. It's the conversation with the donors. It's the conversation with the community, whatever that message is.
Let me give you an example. Okay. Yeah. I was, it was the same organization that I spoke about, aligning the whole organization. All right. Well, I went in and, there was this existing executive assistant. And I'm not, although I started my life in corporate life, I'm not the kind of person who comes in and gives everyone pink slips and starts all over again. I mean, sometimes I would like to do that, quite frankly. But anyway, I try to give people the benefit of a doubt, but not for too long. I mean, I don't have a lot of time. So this particular situation, I was told that the person in the job, and her name happened to be Diane, probably wasn't what I was looking for. In other words, I had been sized up already, So I said, well, we'll just see how that works out. Well, the first little chink in the armor was when I discovered how she was answering the phone. And she said as follows: "Hi, this is Diane. This is the vice president's office. Where can I send you?" Well, that wasn't exactly what I wanted her to do, okay? But that a little coaching, maybe we can get beyond that, okay? But then the real killer was this, okay? We were going to FASB accounting standards. And so I wanted copies of the FASB manual before we had our first board meeting. Okay. And so, these standard manuals, it's 50 pages for $300. Okay, I get it. They've got you. You've got to do it. So I said, I need so many copies of this manual. Okay, fine. Well, we're getting close to the board meeting, and I hadn't seen these things show up. And so I said to Diane, where are the FASB manuals? Oh, I checked and they were too much money. I didn't order them. Okay. So I said, I restrained myself, Jay. Okay. Mm-hmm. I didn't go into my, Donald Trump mode, out. And so I said, I want these here tomorrow. I don't care what it costs. Do you understand me? Okay. So there's that kind of thing too that happens sometimes. And so she eventually was moved to the PR manager's assistant, and the PR manager said to me, "Thanks a lot, Larry." And I said, "Well, hey, you'll be able to handle her a lot better than I was." So there you go. But she kept her job. She'd been there for since Moses or Noah, and so I wasn't gonna, it's not fair just to dump her on the street, but I couldn't have her continue to stay where she was.
Well, yeah, I guess alignment means a lot of things, but one of them is a big alignment in not just what we're communicating, but also how we're communicating it. And it's important that we can speak with some kind of language that makes sense to all the people inside and outside the house, so to speak. Yeah.
Now, here's my assistant, the one I eventually got, and I've always remembered this. And she didn't come as an assistant; she came from a different area. And she said, when people ask me what my job is, I tell them that my job is to represent the college to the vice president and the vice president to the college. Now think about that. I just thought that was incredible. I've never forgotten that. That's how she saw her job.
Yeah.
And believe me, I depended on her. I mean, I would, she had the ability to change my mind on stuff. She would come in there and say, look, here's what I'm seeing. Here's everything. I think you ought to do this and this and this. I go, fine, we'll do it. Because I've always been the kind of person who tries to never be completely fixed within, principles are fixed, but there are a lot of movement around to accomplish the same thing. And I've always wanted to learn things and, okay, what can we do differently? How can we do it? Everything. In fact, I saw this applies to nonprofits. The quote from Socrates came across my desk last week. The intelligent learn from everything and everybody. The average learn from experience. The stupid know everything.
I'm always hesitant to classify anybody in the third category since I'm afraid I'll instantly go into it. But I know I know the quote, and it's true. This hubris is the thing that frightens me more than anything.
Oh,
absolutely.
Yeah. It's a willingness to look at things differently.
Yes, with the growing awareness of how little we know, which hopefully grows with time. And speaking of which, I know our time is short, and I want to make sure I give you an opportunity to give us kind of some final thoughts on this. For those who have the benefit of a coach, if I may describe you that way, among many things, as yourself, it's one thing. For those who don't, what are some of the things that they could do to get themselves, thinking the right way, building the organizational culture that truly works, given whatever tools and whatever size and whatever staffing and board they have?
Well, I would read a book on organizational development, and there's some good, easy ones to read out there. And I would even look at some of the Covey material. It's quite good. If you want to talk about fundraising, there's my book. And we also, we have a very simple tool that's free, actually. We call it the Fundraising Pathfinder, and it's an AI-driven fundraising profiler. And it will give you a measurement of your alignment, and it'll give you tips on how to make it better. And you just simply go to fundraisingpathfinder.com.
I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat so people can grab it.
Fundraisingpathfinder.com. It's free. It takes about 6-7 minutes to do, and then the report is emailed to you.
That's excellent. Thank you for that. And I know you have probably a couple of other closing thoughts, Larry, but before we go there, is there any other kind of link or anything else where people can find out more about you and learn about your work and the book and so forth?
Well, you simply go to the8principles.com, and that's all 3 words spelled out, and it's LES, ideas, not people, the8principles.com. And everything is in there. There are resources, all of the information on our training programs are in there. We do have an online training program as well. It's created for individuals. It's not created for groups, so because it's individual learning. Yeah. Everything is CFRE approved for those of you for whom it makes a difference. It's we aren't selling snake oil. It's the good stuff. And so you can find out and also there are plenty of places there that you can click a link and schedule a time with me. And any initial call with me is purely complimentary, and my job is not to sell you. My job is to figure out what you need and point you in the right direction. And if you want to work with me, fine. If you don't, fine. But I just hate to see people suffer needlessly, and they're kind of swimming around. So hey, schedule a time. We'll talk. I love to talk, as you've probably figured out.
Well, maybe that's a good place for kind of a final salvo question, which is, we've seen so much happen in the last couple of years on so many fronts, including even today on television. So it's from the good, the bad, the ugly, up and down, left and right, all across the board. How, if at all, has that influenced the way you see all these issues? In other words, the way we work together within our organizations, the way we reach out to existing and potential supporters. Has any of that altered at all? Or are you looking at some ways that we can do that work so we can be even better given the new environment we're in?
Well, first of all, I would say that the environment has a lot less influence than people think it does. These sorts of major events tend to run on 10-year cycles. Okay, let's look back. Okay, we had 2001. We had the recession. Then we had the pandemic. You see, these things come along in about 10-year cycles. And so I don't get all exercised over that, because the one thing I do know, and I steadfastly would defend, and that is human nature does not change. It has not changed for millennia. And that's what I built my career on, is tapping into that. Clothing changes, ideas change, practices change, technology changes, all that is the only thing constant is change. And I think that's one of the things that disturbs me about nonprofits is they think they live in a static world, and they don't. Everything is moving constantly, and they need to be prepared for that. And the way to be prepared for it is to understand the underlying principles that are really driving things. And that gives you a sense of confidence too. You realize you're not, by doing that, you're not stepping off into some sort of, hole. I do a weekly newsletter on LinkedIn, and this week the title was Wile E. Coyote, the Complex and Ridiculous. And those of you know who Wile E. Coyote was, I invite you to read it on LinkedIn. There's the guy that was always trapped in the immediate and the need to come up with some contraption to outdo people. And the real irony of that, in real life, a coyote has the advantage over a roadrunner. That's the real irony. He didn't have to do any of that stuff. That's the irony. Think about that. And see, nonprofits are in the same business. They have the real thing. And if I tell you one more little story that I think will illustrate this, true story. I went into a department store about 10 years ago, and I walked up to the men's fragrance counter, whatever you call it. And there was this young clerk there. He walked up to me and he says, "Can I help you?" Well, I love to ask people questions. I love to see their reactions to things. In fact, my wife goes, here he goes again. All right. So in front of me on the counter was this men's magazine, like a Men's Health or something, open to a full page ad of a really well-known men's cologne. You'd know the name of it, but I said it. All right. Very simple full page advertisement. It was a photograph of an Italian gigolo with a blonde in a bikini on a yacht in the Aegean. And then superimposed on that photograph was a picture of the product. So I said to him, "So I have a question." "Oh, yeah. He couldn't wait to answer my question. So I simply said, "If I buy this, do I get hurt?" He looked at me like he was like, "Did I just hear what he said?" And so I rescued him and I said, "Well, that's the implication, isn't it?" "Well, yeah, it is." So what I tell nonprofits is, because the cosmetics industry is selling a counterfeit, and they make billions of dollars doing this. Okay? They've got it down to a science. They really do. So let's have nonprofits tap into the same fundamental yearnings of their donors, self-fulfillment, being a part of something bigger than themselves, you see, which they cannot buy. You see, let's have them do that. You see, and if that's where your focus is, as I said, you won't have the problem of too little. You'll have the problem of too much. And that can be sometimes more damning than too little. There you go.
Well, I think right now, probably most organizations wouldn't mind having a little bit too much, at least in the way of support. And so hopefully we'll find our way to that, and without too much cologne in the process. So thank you very much, Larry, for all of this.
It's true.
And thank you to everybody here who is here for our very spirited conversation as usual. Once again, I have put both the 8 principles and Fundraising Pathfinder in the chat if you missed that, or if you're hearing this after the fact, because this may be live for you, but it's a recording for the next people who see it. It'll be posted over both on the DonorSearch YouTube channel and on the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net under the resources tab, where you'll find all the other webcasts that we've had, as well as the webinars for See a Free Credit, to Larry's point earlier. And if you're interested in these kinds of conversations, delving into the lives of the people behind fundraising and philanthropy, you'll find that in the podcast series. So hope you'll enjoy all of that. And we have sessions coming up in the week and weeks ahead, all throughout the summer, all throughout the year, 90 programs like this. But we would like them to be focused, to Larry's point, around your needs and interests. And so if you would tell us what you want to hear, who you want to see, what you want to see covered, that's exactly what we will do. Just reach out to me. You can reach me at j@donorsearch.net, or you can find me on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever you feel like it. But mainly, we want you to stay healthy, be happy, be well aligned, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, take care.
It was terrific.
Thank you, Larry.